Good morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask all of us here in-house to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones have been silenced as we prepare to begin. And, of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage following today's presentation for your future reference. And our internet viewers are reminded, of course, that questions or comments can be sent to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion appropriately today is Dr. Niall Gardner, the director of our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He is a former aide to Lady Thatcher. He has also worked at the heart of the Washington policy world now for over a decade and is a leading expert on the U.S.-UK special relationship. He is a regular contributor to the London Daily Telegraph and appears frequently on American and British television. He received his doctorate in history from Yale University. Please join me in welcoming Niall Gardner. Niall?
Thanks very much, John, and good morning to everyone. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. We're delighted to have Professor Andrea Mays, author of The Millionaire and the Bard, Henry Folger's obsessive hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio, here with us today. Her new book focuses on one of the most celebrated figures in British history, William Shakespeare. Too often, however, we forget that when Shakespeare died in 1616, his works and words remained largely unpublished. As was usual at the time, it was only due to the efforts of two of his fellow actors from the Globe Theatre in 1623 that his plays survive to this day, in the form of the First Folio, the first edited collection of his plays, including 18 that had never been printed before. Only 750 copies were published, and by the 19th century, the majority had been lost or destroyed. Those remaining were considered the holy grail of book collecting, second only to the rarer Gutenberg Bible. Today, of the 233 remaining First Folios, 82 of them reside only a few blocks away at the Folger Shakespeare Library due to the efforts of one man, Henry Folger. Shakespeare's writings have influenced numerous lives over the centuries, including one close to our hearts here at Heritage, Margaret Thatcher. As Lady Thatcher recalled, "I'm always grateful that at school in my time we were given memory training. You had to learn chunks of Shakespeare." As Prime Minister, she often drew inspiration from his words, though perhaps only the Iron Lady could improve on the Bard, turning a winter of discontent into a glorious summer for Britain, not just in words, but in actions. Upon being awarded the Clare Booth Luce Award in 2002, then Vice President Dick Cheney remarked, "Whenever I think of Margaret Thatcher, I can't help but recall the final lines from Shakespeare's King John. Naught shall make us rue if England to itself do rest but true." Author Andrea Mays has similarly appreciated Shakespeare from a very young age. Andrea has degrees in economics from the State University of New York at Binghamton and from UCLA, and teaches economics at California State University at Long Beach. The Millionaire and the Bard is her first book, and it has received glowing reviews, including by Stephen Greenblatt, editor of the Norton Shakespeare, in the New York Times, who hailed it as an American love story. Please welcome Andrea Mays.
Thank you. I am honored to be here speaking at Heritage and at the Margaret Thatcher Center. And I want to thank Niall and John Hilbo, who disappeared somewhere, and James Carafano, and above all, James Swanson, who put all the puzzle pieces together so that I could be here today. I'm going to be talking today mostly about the connection, how the connection is made between Shakespeare and America. And the first part of the story is about the apotheosis of Shakespeare, which most people don't know that when Shakespeare died in 1616, it was not a given that he would be the secular god of British literature, English language literature. His plays were still being performed. Only half of them had been published, and those had been published essentially by pirates. They were not authorized by the owner of the property of the plays, which would have been the Globe Theatre, nor were they authorized by the author, But they were essentially free writers who would come in, write down what the words of the play were, and then publish them as best they could. So about half of the plays had been published. What would have been lost is important to the story. So I'm going to introduce you to new characters, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, who are the great unsung heroes of English language literature that no one has ever heard of, but now you have. And they were the ones who decided to put together this memorial volume to honor their deceased friend. And had they not, Shakespeare's plays would have survived at probably the same rate of Shakespeare's contemporaries, about 50%. And we would have lost, among other things, Macbeth. So no tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. How many of you studied that in high school? You would not have had the First Folio not been published. No Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar's, Two Gentlemen of Verona, no Kiss Me Kate, because there would have been no Taming of the Shrew. And then my favorite example, which will also illustrate for you what it is that Hemmings and Condell accomplished, aside from just saving the 18 plays, is that the plays had previously been published, sometimes well and sometimes in bad versions. So I'm going to read you a little bit of a soliloquy as it was published in the 1603 quarto of Hamlet, and see if you recognize it. Okay, so to be or not to be, there's the point. To die, to sleep, is that all? All. No, to sleep, to dream. Marry it goes, for in the dream of death when we awake, and borne before an everlasting judge, from whence no passenger e'er returned, the undiscovered country at whole sight, the happy smile, and accursed damned. Okay, well, my English teacher would have told me, A, there's no verb in there, and B, they need new punctuation. But this is the more familiar version that you might know from the First Folio version. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of trouble, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more. That is the version that Hemmings and Condell left us, not the first one. And again, so it's more than just half the plays that they preserved. Hemmings and Condell would have had access to manuscripts had there been any, because they were shareholders, along with Shakespeare, they were shareholders in the Globe Theatre, and they would have had the solitary prompt book copy of each of the plays from which to work. They might have had fair copies of the plays available to them. We don't really know all of the sources they would have used, but we know what the universe of the possibilities are. And they would have edited the plays in the sense that they would have corrected anything in the descriptions or in the soliloquies and said, no, that's not how we did it. That's not how it was performed. I remember when Will was Hamlet's father, and that's not how he did it. So we get the benefit in the First Folio of their editorial contributions. I want to talk quickly about the apotheosis of Shakespeare. It takes a couple centuries, so I'm just going to hit the main highlights. Again, 1616 he dies. He's well known. His plays are still being performed. Shortly after the publication of the First Folio, in 1623, the Puritans take charge in Parliament, and they despise plays. They despise the idea of pretending to be someone that you are not, it is an offense against God. And they had to contend with not only that, but imagine you're a Puritan, you don't like pretending. And women do not appear on the stage in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. Those parts of women are played by boys, who sometimes are playing boys playing girls, or boys playing girls playing boys. So that would probably make your head explode if you're a Puritan. They prohibit the production of these plays, and it's not until the Restoration in 1660 that plays begin to be performed again. The age of Hemmings and Condell and the First Folio means that the last people that would have known Shakespeare are long dead by the time the plays really start to be performed again. 1709, we start with the preservation of the text. So the so-called first editor, actually Hemmings and Condell are really the first editor, but the so-called first editor of Shakespeare's plays, Nicholas Rowe, puts together essentially trying to figure out what the true text of Shakespeare would have been. 1733, we have the first bona fide Shakespeare scholar, Louis Theobald, who is going to collate different quarto versions, quarto editions of the plays and the First Folio. By the 1750s, this First Folio becomes a collectible. We have catalog entries where Shakespeare's First Folio is no longer listed under miscellaneous, but it has its own entry. And then we have a major highlight of the apotheosis of Shakespeare in 1769. Tragic actor David Garrick, who has made a career performing Shakespeare, decides that he's going to create a cottage industry of Shakespeare performances and souvenirs in Shakespeare's hometown. So it's not quite as far-fetched as it sounds. He was, if you will, the P.T. Barnum of his era, and he thought, well, here's this sleepy Stratford market town. They don't really honor Shakespeare. In fact, they're mostly Puritans, and they're not crazy about him being a playwright anyway. But Garrick manages to convince the town, let's have this 3-day feat where we're going to have parades of characters dressed in costume, Shakespeare characters. I'm going to compose an ode to Shakespeare and perform it, which he did, and generally have a festival in the town of Stratford. They build an architectural rendering of a memorial that is on David Garrick's property, and they have these events all planned around that. Well, end of the story is that it turned out to be a disaster. 3 days of fireworks, rain, and mud does not go well, but it put Stratford-upon-Avon on the map, and it creates this cottage industry in Stratford honoring Shakespeare. So if you go there today, you can see Anne Hathaway's cottage, not the actress Shakespeare's wife. You can see the Stratford schoolroom in which they claim that Shakespeare, attended school until he was in 4th grade. We have no evidence of that, so lots of lawyers in the room. I'm not going to tell you anything there's no evidence to support. And various other things, including multitudes of mulberry carved souvenirs, because Shakespeare supposedly planted a mulberry bush outside his house on Henley Street, and supposedly the tree was cut down and made into souvenirs. Well, this must have been a tree the size of Jack and the Beanstalk up to the moon, because there are many, many of those souvenirs out there, including many of them ended up in the Folger Library. So that's the Shakespeare Jubilee. 1840, the Shakespeare Society is founded. 1847, the Shakespeare Trust buys the house that Shakespeare is alleged to have been born in. That's another story. David Garrick went into the house and said, I think this is where he was born, and that is the story that they tell. Shakespeare, 1850s, we start to see Shakespeare influencing other writers, Carlyle, Goethe, and many more after that. So let me read you one little bit from that. By the 1850s, more than 225 years after the publication of the First Folio, Shakespeare's literary reputation was secure, but something else was in the air in early Victorian England, and he was undergoing additional transformation. Scottish writer Thomas Carlyle expressed the feeling as well as anyone when he declared, quote, "This King Shakespeare, does he not shine in crowned sovereignty over all of us in the noblest, gentlest, and yet strongest of rallying signs, indestructible, really more valuable in that point of view than in any other means." He also writes, "We can fancy him as radiant aloft over all nations of Englishmen." Carlyle captured, and this is me speaking, Carlyle captured the moment when Shakespeare became celebrated as more than a great author. He was much more than the most important playwright and poet in British history. Now he transcended literature. His name became synonymous with empire, civilization, and the Anglosphere. So as I get on to past the 1850s, I'm going to explain a little more how this all migrates across the ocean to here. 1685, we know there's a copy not of a First Folio in America yet, but a Fourth Folio. The first copy of a First Folio comes in 1791. 1730 is the first recorded performance of a Shakespeare play in the New World, Romeo and Juliet, in my hometown of New York City. And another sort of highlight of the story of the apotheosis of Shakespeare is the 1849 Shakespeare riots. Okay, so that's an interesting story. There are two actors, Macready and Forrest, Forrest, by the way, owned a First Folio, who are, Macready is English, Forrest is American, and they have competing shows performing Macbeth. And in May 1849, they happened to be in New York City at the same time, on the same evening, performing their competing versions of Macbeth. So a Macbeth smackdown, if you will. And it results in competition, the Americans saying, oh, this Englishman he's too declaratory in his style and he's not relaxed enough, and the Americans saying, the British firing back their salvos. This all ends amazingly in a riot at the Astor Street Opera House. And when I say a riot, I don't mean people waving their playbills and tisking over the performance. The National Guard was called out. This is the first time in history that the National Guard fired upon U.S. American citizens, and it resulted in 22 dead and 120 injured. So they took their Shakespeare very seriously, I guess is my point. All right, 1857 is an important year in the apotheosis because that is the year that Henry Folger is born in the United States. So Henry Folger did everything that he could in his power to change where Shakespeare resided. He was the one who began to he was one who brought British treasures over to the United States in a big way. Henry Folger is born in Brooklyn to a family of modest means. He goes to Amherst College. His father goes belly up during Henry's sophomore year, and it is grace from his best friend Charlie Pratt and Charlie Pratt's father, who turn out to be interesting characters as well, that he is able to finish Amherst. He takes out a loan from the Pratt family. That Pratt family. Pratt Institute, Pratt Hall. There are Pratt Halls all over Amherst College. That's the Pratts. At the end of school, Henry takes a job working as a clerk in Charlie Pratt's dad's oil company, Astral Oil Works in Brooklyn. And through great fortune, that company is taken over by John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. And that is the bottom rung of the organization. Henry works his way up over a 30-year career. In 1911, we see Henry Folger as one of the named defendants in the Standard Oil antitrust case. The remedy of the court is to break the company into 36 different pieces, the second largest of which is Standard Oil of New York, the predecessor company to ExxonMobil, still the largest corporation in the world, depending on Apple's stock price on a particular day. And Henry Folger was running that 9 to 5. And after 5, he and his wife were poring over catalogs from hundreds of book dealers, hundreds of auction houses. All of that paper is maintained. It's all in the Folger archive just up the street. And they were buying up Shakespeareana at an amazing pace. I don't have time to tell you everything they wanted to acquire, the hundreds of thousands of items that they acquired over the 30 years. I will focus my attention mostly on this copy of the copies of the First Folio. So I've already described what the folio is. It is a giant volume. It's large, in a size that printers had previously reserved really only for serious religious and political tracts. So the fact that it was plays and it was unusual. This was giving gravitas to a subject that had previously been treated as sort of ephemeral amusements. When Thomas Bodley formed the Bodleian Library at Oxford, he said that he was not going to accept plays in his library. Apparently he changed his mind later because they were just riffraffs, idle riffraffs. So it's unusual that they would have been produced in this format. It sold pretty briskly. It sold out in 9 years. And subsequent editions were published by others, not by Hemmings and Condell, who had died by that time. In the subsequent editions, and why don't I talk about the other editions? The other editions are not as good as the First Folio, in part because Hemmings and Condell are not around to say yes or no, this is how it was, this is not how it was. But also because the pirates that published, or the publishers that produced the subsequent editions, found new Shakespeare plays to put in that actually turn out not to be. So imagine there's a bestseller out there and they say, here's Shakespeare's plays, they're selling really well. And they say, oh, I found a few new Shakespeare plays. They're not Shakespeare plays at all. So the second, third, and fourth folios are not as true to the text as the first is. Henry and Emily pursue copies of the Shakespeare First Folio in a way that most collectors of the Gilded Age did not. Their main competitors would have been J.P. Morgan and Henry Huntington, who were collecting high spots. They didn't collect just Shakespeareana. They collected all kinds of manuscripts, all kinds of books, and particularly they each wanted a great, tall, complete copy, especially one if it had a flashy binding. Okay, so J.P. Morgan's copies are just beautiful bindings. But once they had acquired that, they were pretty much out of the market for folios, and Henry had a lot of leeway to be able to buy these at auction. Imagine, Henry Folger was not a poor man. He was making $50,000 a year as president of Standard Oil, $100,000 as chairman, but he spent that in a single year on one book. So his money came from primarily business deals that he did through Standard Oil and through the extremely generous dividends that Standard Oil was paying. Nonetheless, Henry Huntington could write a check for $1.2 million at one sitting and buy an entire collection. So, imagine you go to an auction and you're collecting Emily Dickinson and Bill Gates walks through the door. Okay, not going to get that. And that's where Henry Folger was. In part, that is why he wanted to be secret about his acquisition. So he never let anyone other than his wife know how many copies of the First Folio he'd actually bought. Not even his scholar friends, not his co-workers, no one knew how many he had acquired. And sort of one of the surprises is how much they acquired over the 30 years. They lived in a rented house in Brooklyn, in Clinton Hill in Brooklyn. He took the streetcar to work and until he was president of the company. And they had rented furniture, never owned a home until he retired from Standard Oil. And they spent every dime and every moment buying Shakespeareana. Very successfully. I want to tell you about one particular acquisition story that sort of brings together the Anglosphere, and that is a copy. It also illustrates the point of the resentment that developed in England for Americans who were coming there with large amounts of cash and buying their culture. And the story is about the Bodleian. So the Bodleian Library is a library at Oxford that received deposit copies. So each of the printers, when they produced something, would send something to the Bodleian, one to Cambridge, and in sheets, and then the library would have them bound. As it turns out, the Bodleian had a fantastic binder named William Wildgoose, who kept great meticulous records of his binding. We actually have the record of the binding of this copy. And this would have been one of the earliest copies off the press, put into a leather binding that had a hasp on the end of it. Try to imagine this, a piece of furniture on the end of the binding through which a chain was inserted, and then the book was locked to a post so that if you wanted to borrow it, you would take it off the shelf and you'd stand and read it but you couldn't take it. That was the point. You couldn't pinch the Bodleian copy of the First Folio. Turns out the Bodleian didn't have that much respect for plays because not that long afterward, 1664, the Bodleian sells the First Folio as surplus for £24. Boy, I wish I'd been at that library sale. As surplus because they've received the second and third folios, which they assume are better. Okay, so the Bodleian copy disappears for a couple of centuries until a collector brings it into the Bodleian and asks them to verify that in fact it is a First Folio, and maybe they know which copy it is, and of course they see this binding with a hasp on the end and they say, I think we know who might have bound this. It's come home, here we are, we have our Bodleian copy and it's come back in the doors. So the collector says, sure, I'll sell it. And right after they've verified it, right, then he's going to sell it to them, and he asks for rumored price that he asks for is £2,000. Henry Folger finds out about this through a newspaper article and through one of his book dealers in London, and he says, £3,000, I'm sending you and wiring you the money now, go get it. And he figures he's got it all sewn up. Well, not so. The Bodleian Library, of course, tries to buy this back. So they put pleas into the newspapers. Librarian E.W.B. Nicholson reframes the Bodleians' predicament into a referendum on their patriotism, and here's what he wrote in the Times of London. He's pleading for people to make donations so that they can buy the Bodleian copy back. Unless the Bodleian copy can be recovered, there will be an indelible blot on our scutcheon. At present, about £1,300 has been received or promised in hundreds of subscriptions, but I do not think they can raise that total to £2,000, which is what the collector was asking for. That after 2.5 centuries, we should have the extraordinary chance of recovering this volume and should lose it because a single American can spare more money than Oxford sons or friends is a bitter prospect. It is the more bitter because the abnormal value put on this copy by our competitor rests on knowledge ultimately derived from our own staff and our own registers. But from so cruel a jibe of fortune, this appeal may perhaps save us. So he's trying to get people to give him money. That doesn't really work. They managed to raise £1,937, just shy of the 2,000, and the collector extends the deadline for raising the money, much to Henry Folger. Henry's thinking he's closing the deal. You guys don't have the money. I'm closing the deal Monday, and he doesn't get it. On March 6th, the Times of London printed an indignant letter from Mr. Edmund Goss, and this results in a cartoon that I've reproduced in the book. Who is this millionaire? Why does he offer a sum 3 times larger than has hitherto been the market value of the book? Is he a private person? Is he a tradesman? Okay, yeah, couldn't be that Bodleian was going to be deprived of its treasure by somebody who is actually in trade. No, he wasn't. The end of the story. Does Henry Folger get the copy or not? Tick-tock, tick-tock. The last contribution is made by Lord Strathcona and Mount Royal, High Commissioner of Canada. Yeah, and he makes the final donation that allows the Bodleian to buy the copy back. So that is the copy in the book I have not yet seen. That is still at the Bodleian at Oxford. Let me read you one more piece. English Shakespeare scholar Sidney Lee was honest enough to point the finger of blame in the right direction for the complaints about the transatlantic trade and culture. If the Americans are getting all of these treasures, it's our own fault. While we admired the superior enterprise of the American collector, we could not but grieve over the insensibility of our own rich men who allowed these heirlooms to leave our shores without making any effort to retain them here. One smaller and more flickering shadow has been cast across the brilliant page of Shakespeare's fame. The cartoon that is produced in the newspaper looks a little bit like Uncle Moneybags from the Monopoly character. A guy with a top hat clasping 2 bags of money, and he's got no face. Who is this millionaire? And essentially objecting to the idea that with mere cash, you could buy these things from people who are willing sellers. as a sort of way of summarizing what Henry Folger manages to do, he considered it liberating these volumes from the shelves, dusty shelves of the libraries of aristocrats, where no one would ever have been able to see them. And he brought them instead, donated them to the American people, put them on Capitol Hill, and where American scholars and the American public can see some of them. Henry Folger decided to build a library. He originally tried to build it in New York City, but amazingly found out that real estate was very expensive there, and he couldn't do it under budget. He ended up buying 14 lots on East Capitol Street over a 9-year period using multiple real estate agents, again, so that it would be secret who it was that was buying these up. And after 9 years, he didn't drink any champagne to celebrate it. He just proceeded with the planning of the library. The day after he acquires the last lot on East Capitol Street, he opens the newspaper, and Congress is about to take that block for the expansion of the Library of Congress. Imagine you've spent your life, 9 years of your life planning, and then there's going to be a taking. That's for you, about the taking, right? Henry Folger did what any president or CEO of a major corporation would do. He sent a telegram to the Librarian of Congress, and he said, is the government going to take this property? I had planned to put my library there. And within 6 months, Henry Folger, the Librarian of Congress, and a congressman managed to carve out from the bill that Congress was using to take that property that the 14 lots that Henry Folger had bought. So because there were complementary uses, that front portion, which is the Folger Library, was retained by Henry Folger, and the rest of the block is now the Adams Building for the Library of Congress. So if you ever wonder why didn't they have any frontage on East Capitol, or why is that side of the building so blank, that explains it. So sort of just to close here, and then I'll take any questions you might have. Henry Folger gave just about everything he earned to that library and to us. You can go there and you can see a copy of the First Folio on display every day in the exhibition hall. There's another electronic copy of another folio that is on exhibit there. They exhibit tidbits from this enormous collection that descends 4 floors underground in cooled is not the right word, freezing vaults of all kinds of treasures you can't even begin to imagine, but you can read about some of them in the book. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for a really compelling, fascinating talk. I'd like to take the liberty of asking the opening question. You've spoken about the tremendous passion of Henry Folger for Shakespeare. What drove your own interest in Shakespeare? And I know it started at a very, very young age, but what ultimately drove you to write this book?
Well, 2 things. One is that I started in middle school. I started studying Shakespeare because of a great teacher, and then on in high school, I had Frank McCourt, the great Irish storyteller, was my poetry teacher, and he had something to contribute to how it is that you write a story, what's the arc of the story, and a little bit of humor in there as well. So that's the beginning part, is why I was interested in the plays. And then since 13, I've been watching and reading the plays, listening to the LPs, now CDs, now podcasts of the plays. So I have always been interested from that aspect. Then in the 1980s, when I first moved to Washington, D.C. to be in the Reagan administration, I used to walk by the Folger every day on my way to work. And when it came time to write a book, I'd already helped my husband James with editing 6 of his books, and he and his agent said, you can do this, write about something you know something about and something you like, because you don't want to spend years with a subject you don't like. Okay, Shakespeare, I'm walking by Folger. And on a tour by chance at the Folger Library, I overheard one of the docents when one of the patrons asked, well, where did the money come from that built the collection? And she said, Mr. Folger worked for an oil company. And I thought, well, this is a story that needs to be told. He worked for Standard Oil as it became this amazing, huge industry, as it was the most reviled company in the universe. And I explain why that happened and why it is probably a mistake to assume that everything that Standard Oil did in the era was evil. I wrote about that as well. My economics degree helped me a bit with that. So I just integrated those two stories in a way that I think makes it a compelling narrative and introduces you to this long-lost industrialist that no one has ever heard of, and every time they hear the word Folger, they will no longer think of coffee. They will think of Shakespeare, I hope.
Right, now I take questions from the audience. Gentlemen here.
What was my question? Did the Folgers actually enjoy Shakespeare, or did they just love? Niall used the phrase "obsessive quest." I mean, there can be people that collect for the sake of collecting. Did they go to plays frequently? Did they read to each other? Did they read themselves? I know Folger wrote some articles on Shakespeare, but were they about the contents of the play?
Yes to all of that. Emily Folger kept a diary of in the front of the diary says plays I've seen. So she recorded her reactions and if he attended, his reactions to the plays that they would see. Yes. They attended plays as often as they could. They did read the books. They did actually read the plays. So he was an unusual collector in that these were not just fetish objects, which First Folios did become. How big is it? Was it bleached? Was it resewn? Or these pages all original to this copy? All of those things that collectors obsess about, they did as well. But they weren't just the fetish objects. They actually read the plays. Henry Folger had a copy of a play in his pocket, and he would walk Lower Manhattan by by Battery Park, reading on his lunch hour. So he was known to do that. So yeah.
What were his articles, though?
He wrote one about Shylock, and for those of you who don't know the story of the Merchant of Venice, there's a contract dispute. I mean, essentially somebody puts a forfeitable bond into a contract, and then the terms of the contract are not met, and when it comes time to pay what the forfeitable bond is, anybody know what the bond is? Pound of flesh. That's where that expression comes from. Antonio does not want to give up the pound of flesh, so they try to find some legal argument around that. And Folger, being a lawyer as well, he went to night school at Columbia, wrote an article about whether Shylock was in the right position legally or not. Then she wrote her thesis on the true text of Shakespeare, and there are numerous other things, including, he wrote a lot about his acquisitions. He wrote a lot about the copy that I detail in the book, the Vincent copy, and his pursuit of that copy as well. So those are the kinds of things he wrote about. Any other?
Sorry, the lady over here.
Andrea, is the library still actively acquiring items?
The answer is yes, but not First Folios. The last two First Folios to come up to auction went for $5 million and $6.1 million each. So even with the second best endowed private library in the United States, that would be a big chunk of your acquisitions budget. They do acquire items all the time. Some are big and flashy. They acquired a giant oil painting of a scene from Romeo and Juliet, so large that there's only one place in the library that it could fit. It reminded me a little bit, if you've ever toured Hearst Castle. Hearst would buy treasures from England, bring them back, and then he would say, oh, that doesn't fit. They would cut so that it would fit in the... Okay, they didn't cut anything, but there's only one place in the library that it fits. They acquired smaller items all the time. And in fact, they acquired 2 copies of this book. So, yeah.
Mrs. Swanson.
Twice in the 20th century, American land armies have crossed the sea to aid England. Do you attribute the Anglosphere and much of its closeness to Shakespeare connecting England and America? And do you have any personal connection to this Anglosphere and these wars and this bond?
Do I? If you read the dedication page, the book is dedicated to my mother, who was my first teacher, and to my father, who left Sussex at age 17 and joined the Navy and served on His Majesty's HMS Nelson during World War II. So that's the World War II connection. Did Shakespeare have something to do with establishing that connection? The answer, certainly yes. And among other things, I would point to Laurence Olivier's film version of Henry V, which was played in England frequently during World War II as a way of boosting morale. So you can imagine sitting in a movie theater, on a darkened street in Sussex, in Brighton it would have been, being roused by the St. Crispin's Day speech or by Henry's admonition. So that would be an exemplar of that connection.
Hi, do you think that there are any problems, maybe like ethical problems with like Americans taking things that maybe belong or were created in Britain to America, or the British taking things that were in Greece and bringing them back to London?
Okay.
Obviously, we're glad that we have these things, but sometimes it seems like they should belong back home.
Okay, great question. And the answer is I have no ethical problem when there's a voluntary transaction between the owner of a property and someone who wants to acquire it. So if this had been taken, if he'd gone and stolen these from people's, there are stories in the book, by the way, of people who did that. If he had taken the property, I would say they should be returned. But if we have a voluntary transaction, you have, for example, a first son who inherits all of the property of his father, and he has no cash, and he doesn't really care much for those old books lying up on the shelf, but he really likes horses, so he sells the book and he buys the horses, which is something he prefers. I have no problem with that. The Greek example, Jason is probably better qualified to talk about than I am. If they were taken, it's a different question than if this was done by a voluntary transaction by somebody who rightfully owned it.
You had another question.
A comment on that, if it's print, I think it's reproducible in many forms, so it's, that in black ink my love may still shine bright, as Shakespeare says.
But I think if we had the Dead Sea Scrolls and we photocopied them and sent a copy back, they wouldn't be happy with that either.
Still, there's a difference between the Elgin marbles.
Yeah.
And I think, my question was, you seem to imply that it's the two actors, Hemming and Condell, that showed the initiative in this. How'd they get their funding, and why are there three earls as dedicatees? Did they approach the earls? And why don't you mention Ben Jonson?
Ben Jonson contributed dedicatory verses.
That's all?
Yeah.
Not arrangement of the...
Nope. That was Hemmings and Condell who did that, who decided which play. The speculation, that we don't know. The answer is we don't know. We don't have anybody who wrote, hey, this is why we put The Tempest first. But here's a guess, is that it was still being performed and it was very popular. So it was the first one on the catalog. The dedication to the earls was an attempt to get, give us some money. But they did not finance the operation. They did not finance it. No, not by subscription. The Hemmings and Condell put the plays together. The paper was the major expense of the project, and that was financed by the publisher.
And how much would a First Folio cost?
On the day that it was published, without a binding, it would have cost you £1. And then you could take it to your binder, or you could buy it in a sorrel binding, was a little bit more than that, but you could take it to your own binder, but £1. Now, just sort of by comparison, a play being purchased by the theater company from Shakespeare would have cost between £2 and £5. You could buy a single play in the equivalent of a paperback for about 5 pence. So this would be 20 times that. So it was expensive.
A question for you with regard to Henry Folger. Was he a political man at all? And of course, he built this tremendous library on Capitol Hill. Of course, as you mentioned, the cost of establishing such a library in Manhattan would have been prohibitive. But did he seek to influence the thinking of policymakers here in Washington through Shakespeare's works? Was that an aspect of this at all?
I think he hoped to do that in the future. He one of the reasons he put it in Washington instead of another low-cost location, which was Nantucket, it would be hard to get to, Amherst. He also considered sending the collection back to Stratford upon Avon, but then he decided and he wrote, "I am an American," and he let the collection stay here. Possibly, I wouldn't blame him if he were slightly irked that the British press had been had so reviled him for buying all these things. How dare you buy these things? Well, raise some money and buy it yourself. Yeah, would have been the American attitude. No doubt he was slightly irritated by that. But I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes.
Yeah,
no,
okay.
that's an excellent answer.
Okay, he was not, the answer as to whether he was a political man,
Yeah.
no. He kept his head down.
Right.
I was only able to find one photograph of him with John D. Rockefeller. He kept a very low profile. He was very secretive. He was not flamboyant. He was not the guy with a big cigar at Delmonico's. I don't know if you know who that is, but he was not, he did not want a lot of attention, either for collecting or for what he was
Yeah.
doing at Standard Oil.
Extremely low-key figure.
Right. He belonged to a couple of clubs in New York for collectors, the Hobby Club, and he went to the Grolier Club, but he would not have been the guy who would have done been on a dais talking about industry. That was not him. Any other questions?
I have 2 questions, really. I'd love to hear more about the Nantucket connection. I assume he was part of the Nantucket Folger.
That's correct. The
family.
Whaling Museum there
Yeah.
has got Folgers in it all over the place.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the other is, you didn't mention among the other collectors that he was kind of in competition with Lessing Rosenwald, who was, of course, a collector associated with Washington, D.C. and the Library of Congress. Was there any interaction between the two of them?
Not that I'm aware of. There was minimal interaction between him and other collectors, except if they were selling. Except if they were selling. He did not want to meet with, he was not the guy who would meet over dinner and say, "Oh, you've got that edition, I've got this edition. Oh, wait, you've got to see this." That was not him. He was very closed-mouthed about it, in part because he thought correctly that if people got wind of what he was doing, that the president of Standard Oil is buying this, it would drive the prices up. And he was right. He was also slightly delusional in thinking that he could keep it that secret, but he managed until his death. We did not really know what it was that was in the collection. In fact, when the library opened and 2,000 cases of books packed away for years, for decades. I have 30 years of records of warehouse receipts for the stuff that he packed up, shipped away, packed up, shipped away. 2,000 cases came down to Washington when that library opened. And the collection is so vast, if you can believe it, there's still items that are not cataloged, not individually cataloged yet. Okay, other questions? Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been an honor.
And on behalf of Heritage and the Margaret Thatcher Centre, I'd like to thank Andrea for a tremendous talk today, and also to thank all of you for joining us here at Heritage. We look forward to welcoming you back for future events. We do have copies of the book available for sale outside. Andrea, I wish you all the best for the success of what is a fascinating, compelling read. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you.